blasting, billowing, bursting forth with the power of 10 billion butterfly sneezes.
I'm Tom Bain, and this is Wine, Money, and Song. If you're interested in wines and wanting to find out the best values, please subscribe. I've been talking about Bordeaux a lot lately, and the market is in flux now. But I want to go across the ocean to California and what's going on in California, especially Napa Valley, and how they're being impacted by the downturn in the economy and also the problem with younger demographics not drinking wine. And I'm going to really center this conversation about Napa Valley. And Napa Valley is the jewel of all of California wine areas. The reason for that is it has a Mediterranean climate that only like 2% of the world really has. And a Mediterranean climate supports many diverse soils and microclimates. And Napa Valley, because of the mountains and the valleys, has a very diverse climate. But before I get into what's happening now and what conditions are now, I'm going to talk about the history of Napa Valley and how they got to be famous and to be the area in California. And then later we'll follow up with the present conditions. So hopefully this will be a good look into what was and what is and what's going to be in Napa Valley. So you see before me 3 bottles of Napa Valley wine. Dunn, who makes a Napa and a Howell Mountain Cuvée. You have Mayacamas, and you have Diamond Creek, who has 4 or 5 different wines that they make, Cabernet wines. And these are the gold standards in Napa Valley, and the Diamond Creeks are over $300 now. The Mayacamas is $150, as is the Dunn, Howell Mountain. And these are wines that were made for decades and decades, and they were pioneers in the history of Napa Valley. But first, let me go back and just look at the history of Napa Valley. And I'm going to have to read a lot of dates for you. So in 1849, Napa County was formed in 1849, and the first vineyards were planted in 1836. And in 1861, the Charles Krug Winery was the first commercial winery to be set up in Napa Valley, 1861. And Napa Valley was awarded the first AVA in all of California. And that's a designation, an agricultural vineyard designation area. You know, it's an area for agricultural wine, and grapes are grown in that area. They're the first ones to get that the certification. In 1889, Napa had 140 wineries. 140. Schramsberg, who makes sparkling wines, was in 1862. Beringer was 1876. And Inglenook, 1879. And to me, Inglenook made some of the greatest wines ever in California under John Daniels and Captain Nebon, who founded Inglenook originally, and John Daniels came later, made some of the greatest wines. But something happened right after 1900. Phylloxera hit in Napa Valley. And there was something like 19,000 acres planted to vines and grapes. Only 2,000 survived, and the rest had to be ripped out and replanted. So if you think about it, basically the industry went away. Yeah, you had less than 20% of what you had before. And that was a deep blow for the industry. It's like they ceased for like 5 years. But even worse, what happened to Napa Valley, let alone the whole country, I believe it's the Holstell Act, which is prohibition, 1920. And what prohibition did, it shut down the alcohol industry for 13 years until it was repealed in 1933. But what it did is that people who were growing grapes, all of a sudden, unless they were selling it to churches as sacramental wine, they couldn't make wine and sell it. So that forced them to rip up vines and to plant olive trees, plant prune trees, nuts, and that happened for 13 years. And what that did is all the people who were involved with the wine industry, they had to find another means of employment. And they couldn't wait. And if you think about Prohibition last 13 years. So once they came out of Prohibition in 1933, those wineries were abandoned for 14 years. No one was taking care of them. The vines were just growing, however they grow. No one was maintaining the soil, the vines, and the buildings, the wineries. So all of a sudden, people started popping their heads back in, but they didn't have workers. They didn't have winemakers. They didn't have people to work the fields. They didn't have people to clean the barrels out. They didn't have people to bottle the wines. And that took many years to finally to get the industry back together. And what that entailed was finding a new workforce and people who were talented in winemaking. They had to come from overseas where winemaking was legal. And a lot of the winemakers came from Italy. And a lot of people who bought wineries came from Italy because it's their culture. Just to read a few names of the famous wineries from the 50s and the 60s. John Daniels Jr. from Inglenook, who I thought made some of the greatest wines ever made in California. George de la Tour, a Frenchman who took over BV vineyards, and George Latour was very smart. He hired Andrei Teleshev as winemaker, and he became the dean of winemaking. Everyone in California wanted to study under Andrei Teleshev, and he gave birth to many great winemakers. Michael Gergich. You can have a whole line of people who worked for Andrei Teleshev. And then you had Louis Martini vineyard in Napa Valley, and I have a great affinity for the Louis Martini wines. When I first got into wines in the late 60s, early 70s, Martini was rocking and rolling. He made great everyday wines, and he made a Cabernet, which was very California-like, but really balanced and well made. And I remember the 1970 vintage. Now everyone talks about the 74s, the 68s, and the 68s were great wines. But the 1970, there was a bad frost. And I think they made a third of the wine, and they were very in short supply. But I remember being able to get 5 cases from my retail store in Queens and drinking those wines, the 1970, and it was so good. It was so good. I remember selling at retail for $3.99. And the rest of his wines, the Mountain Barbera, which came from Monte Rosso vineyard, very, very old vines. and he made a really good Zinfandel. And then you had the Sebastiani winery, August Sebastiani, who made outstanding Barbera, Zinfandel, and some good cabs. Those were the people who built the foundation of the California wine industry after Prohibition. And what changed it was the Mondavi family. And the Mondavi family bought Charles Krug Winery, which was the first commercial winery ever planted in Napa Valley. And the family bought it, and eventually Robert Mondavi from the Mondavi family separated it in a very, very famous lawsuit that he sued his family for part of the winery so he can open up his own winery. And in 1966, Robert Mondavi opened up the first new winery in Napa Valley, the first license for like 30 years in 1966. And what makes Robert Mondavi very important to California wine history, let alone Napa, is he wasn't a great winemaker, but he was a great promoter of California wines, Napa Valley wines, and his own wines. And he was a very key marketing guy, but he could also raise capital. And when he opened up his winery was spectacular, very contemporary and Spanish mission style. And the one thing Mondavi knew, he hired the best winemakers. And a lot of the winemakers it's a list of in the Hall of Fame. So when Mondavi started shooting out his wines, the wines really had a premium quality to them. And he made very good Pinot Noir, which no one did at that time in California. Very few. Hansel did, Chalon did, but he made very good Pinot Noir. But his Cabernets got a lot of the PR, and they were very good. They were very good. And as I said, he had great vineyards, and he was able to raise money to invest in the winery, and he made really good wines. And the Cabernet Reserve, starting with the 60, 68, 69, excellent wines. The 70 to 74 is special. So he put a premium on his wines, and all of a sudden the price of Napa Valley wine started going up and up, and Mondavi is the guy who started that. But a key thing that happened in 1976 was the Judgment of Paris. And just to refresh your memory, in 1976, Stephen Spurrier, who I met a few times, he was a retailer in Paris, and I did visit his store several times when I was in Paris and bought some wines there. He set up a tasting of the best French wines versus the best California wines. And he had expert tasters from the European press there. And the shock of the world was the California wines beat the French wines in these tastings. And the 1973 Chateau Montelena Chardonnay finished number one. And some of the red wines were right there beating everything else. So what that Judgment of Paris did is it solidified and certified that California, especially Napa Valley, made wines of high quality and sometimes to the level of the French wines. And after that, the gold rush started, and all companies started to say, hey, look how these wines are selling, the prices are going up, let's buy a vineyard. And as I do the second part of this episode, I will show you all the companies coming in and buying up land and tripling the wineries in Napa Valley. But that's next time. Hopefully you enjoy the history of Napa Valley.